In the interview with David Benatar at the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, I was glad that he was mentioned Amanda's initiative to make the Oxford English Dictionary recognize the term antinatalism, and that he was asked for his opinion on the definition. I think his answer is very good. The definition of antinatalism indicated in the initiative that was read to him at the interview is that antinatalism is a philosophical position that assigns a negative value to birth. This definition is the same as the one reported on several websites, which I have often seen online. Benatar points out that there are two errors in this definition. One is the reference to birth, which is an error because antinatalism doesn't oppose birth or any other events that follow or precede the creation of a sentient being, like conception, but it opposes only the creation itself. If antinatalism were against birth, it would see the creation of sentient beings as morally permissible as long as they are not born, but this is not the case. Also, the term birth is not specific to sentient organisms, but may refer to non-sentient organisms as well, and this is the explanation that David Benatar gave at the interview. So it's important to specify that we are talking about the creation of sentience, nothing else. The second error that Benatar points out is the formula assign a negative value, which is not a precise definition of what antinatalism does. It doesn't simply assign a negative value to procreation, but it states that it is morally wrong to procreate, and it does so categorically. Assigning a negative value to procreation implies that although it is considered as negative, there might be conditions in which procreation is acceptable or even preferable. For example, in case creating sentient beings leads to the prevention of the creation of a bigger number of sentient beings. This can also be understood, at least from my point of view, by the definition indicated in the initiative, in the part that states that the suffering that sentient produces is not necessary, as if to say that if procreation were somehow necessary, there could be exceptions, but that is not the case. Antinatalism categorically states that we must not create sentient beings, and that is with no exceptions. As David Benatar says, the exact definition of antinatalism is the ethical position that we ought not to bring sentient beings into existence. What antinatalism says is precisely that we ought not to create sentient beings, nothing else. This is the only thing that all antinatalists have in common. In the definition proposed by Amanda's initiative, there is also a part that says antinatalism is the idea that procreation is unethical, that the suffering sentience produces is unnecessary, and that life, both human and or animal, should cease to procreate and become extinct. That doesn't seem entirely correct to me. Clearly, antinatalism considers the beginning of existence as a serious harm in any case, which is the reason why it states that creating sentient beings is wrong. So, antinatalism, or at least sentiocentric antinatalism, view the reproduction of animals as a serious harm, also when not intentionally caused by humans, as in the case of wild animals, but it doesn't state that we have a moral duty to prevent other animals or humans from reproducing, nor that we necessarily have to be in favor of such kind of intervention. If anything, this is a possible ramification on a practical, active level, is a type of intervention that can be made in particular cases, like the one of the prevention of wild animal suffering. But from this point of view, antinatalism is actually neutral. In other words, an antinatalist can be both for and against a similar kind of intervention. Now, I personally, I don't see how an antinatalist could be against preventing the reproduction of animals when it doesn't cause serious suffering or death to anyone, but I can see how an antinatalist might consider it wrong to prevent wild animals from reproducing in case it does entail the infliction of serious suffering or death. Antinatalism is certainly not the position that we must actively intervene to prevent the creation of sentient beings at all costs. I am in favor of intervening in order to prevent wild animals' reproduction only through non cruel interventions, which provide for a study that foresees any possible effects of such an intervention in order to avoid causing suffering or death to other sentient beings. Violence towards sentient beings in order to prevent them from reproducing, despite not being incompatible with antinatalism, is certainly not implied in the position. For example, my thought is that these kind of actions or views are morally wrong. They're actually indecent and also harmful for the potential benefits of the position itself. I think it is important to understand antinatalism and not to transform it into what we would like it to be, going beyond its meaning. Also, I think antinatalism should be recognized as an umbrella term, as it covers a range of positions or versions of the position, sometimes even in contrast to each other. To specify the main differences or subcategories, the definition could be added that antinatalism can be applied to all sentient beings, Sentiocentric antinatalism, or to human beings only, Anthropocentric antinatalism. In theory, antinatalism applies to all sentient beings, not only to humans, nor only to sentient beings of some particular species. But actually, the anthropocentric version of antinatalism does exist, since there are and there will be people who share the antinatalist position but apply it only to sentient beings that belong to the human species. It makes sense to include this particular form of antinatalism in its definition, I think, as a kind of secondary version of it. This can be somehow justified from a logical point of view as well, I think, because although the anthropocentric version of antinatalism contrasts with the main definition, anthropocentric antinatalists still use antinatalist arguments, and some of these arguments are specific to humans. And they, for example, some of the harm experienced by humans, like their common ability to understand that they will die, or also most of the harm caused by humans is quite unique in many ways. So there might be arguments that address this particular form of harm that humans experience and cause. Lastly, the definition of antinatalism could include information on the arguments supporting the position, specifying the most important differences, for example, through a wording like this. The arguments in support of antinatalism are often divided in two categories: the ones that concern the harm caused to the individuals created through their creation, direct harm arguments or philanthropic arguments when applied only to humans, and the ones that concern the harm caused to other individuals through those who are created, indirect harm arguments or misanthropic arguments when applied only to humans. So logically, these differences apply to the arguments in support of both sentiocentric and anthropocentric antinatalism, but actually these distinctions are unlikely to be needed for both of them equally. What I mean by that is that they are more likely to be relevant and useful for the anthropocentric antinatalism in order to identify different groups of people who support the one or the other, the philanthropic antinatalism or the misanthropic one. In fact, antinatalism includes all these different positions, even when they are adopted partially, and even when they create contrast between antinatalists themselves. Although I think it makes sense to include all these versions of the position in its definition, even when they are incompatible with each other, there might be a need for new terms to better identify and distinguish them, but without replacing or abandoning the terms that already exist.